welcome to this lecture focused on an overview of ethical decision making. We're going to be highlighting a number of factors that go into the ethical decision making process with particular focus on how this relates to those engaging in ethical decision making within the workplace context, as well as those who are thinking about providing leadership and pastoral reflection for workplace leaders in light of the important ethical decisions that need to be made. When we think about the contemporary ethical crisis that we're facing in our day and age, certainly ethics has not been just a new conversation, but we are pressed with ethical decisions as significantly now as we ever have been. And we can look to the past couple decades to find key examples of this in the marketplace, thinking of things such as Bernie Madoff and his Ponzi scheme, Kenneth Lay and some of the work with Enron and the issues that emerged there, or even Martha Stewart and some of the ethical and legal challenges that she engaged in and faced. And of course, there really is no sector that is exempt from ethical kinds of decisions and issues that arise. We open up our newspapers on any given day and we can find issues where ethics, and for better or worse, are touching people in multiple sectors, from the marketplace and business on to churches and nonprofits, NGOs, and on to the political realm as well. It's interesting even to think through what might our founding fathers have thought of if they would have been able to look ahead and see the kinds of ethical issues that are being faced currently in the political realm. Now, we don't want to overly romanticize things when we go back and look at things like our founding fathers, but it is interesting to observe how even the shift in the way happiness is viewed over the years. When we think about the language of the pursuit of happiness included in the Declaration of Independence, when we think of happiness in a contemporary mindset, it oftentimes is rooted in really what depends on the individual's perspective. What makes them happy? What is their personal preference? And how does that feed into their understanding of the pursuit of happiness? That would be a common cultural understanding of happiness in our day and age. But you go back to times such as around the founding of the U.S. in 1776, and happiness would have been understood more around the language of the practice of moral excellence. In other words, there was a sense of character and virtue that was infusing these understandings of that which was involved with the pursuit of happiness. Now, again, there were plenty of ethical challenges in those days as well, but this idea of grounding our moral decision making in a rubric of moral excellence and virtue and character is something that is we don't see as much in our day, and yet is needed as we face more complex, increasingly complex ethical issues and decisions that need to be made. So why is attention to ethics so vital for workplace individuals? There's a number of angles we could share about this, and one of those is that when we give attention to ethics, or if we have lack of attention to ethics, there is significant harm that can be brought to people and the institutions that those people make up. And so we want to be thoughtful in how we approach our ethical decision making to help prevent that harm that is brought to people and institutions, and the flourishing that happens when those institutions are in healthy, vital relationship with the broader society. So we want to engage in good ethical decision making to help prevent this significant harm. It also relates to success and failure in careers, our own careers, and the jobs and well-being and flourishing of those who have work based upon a healthy, thriving organization as well. It also relates to people's commitments to carry out their duty to help making organizations better. positive ethical decision-making practices are needed for the sake of our organizations being healthy and flourishing. And I think there's a couple other real priorities as well. One just being this broad category of our own personal vantage point around ethical decision making and how it flows or has a disconnect from our own sense of personal faithfulness, being committed to and serving transcendent purposes in our lives, and living with a sense of integrity and character. And of course, we can draw on other examples, but the personal domain, the personal dimension of why ethics matter is vital. And of course, the need, just the reality that decisions have to be made. And for better or worse, these decisions have consequences. Now, sometimes these decisions are fairly simple and ethically straightforward, and that's great when that's the case. But at times, we're faced with decisions that have significant complexity, and by extension, moral ambiguity to them as well that goes along with that complexity. Sometimes decisions are complex but not morally ambiguous, but sometimes they are. And it's in those moments where ethical decision making becomes even more important, that we have a process to draw upon, that we have a set of principles and guidelines to draw upon to help us and to help people who are in the workplace and in the marketplace think about ethical decisions in light of these realities. So decisions still have to be made, whether they're easy decisions or hard decisions, and decisions have consequences, for better or worse, and we need to press into this in order to think about how to approach these complexities in meaningful ways. Well, drawing from Ray and Wong's book, Beyond Integrity, early on in their work, they highlight an ethical dilemma that a marketplace leader is facing, and then highlight 6 different angles, different people who are coming to this situation, providing their guidance, their perspective, based upon different ethical systems and ethical theories. And those can be highlighted around 6 different ethical systems and theories. I just want to quickly walk through what Ray and Wong highlight in these 6 areas. The first ethical system that they highlight is that of ethical egoism. This is really a system that defines morality and determines morality primarily by self-interest. So how will this decision affect me as the one making the decision? What will be best for my own self-interest is ethical egoism as a label. The next is called utilitarianism, and this is where morality is determined by the resultant end of an act. So it's not primarily the means by which the act is carried out or the end is carried out, but rather the end. And so what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people is a very pragmatic decision-making process attached to it. And in this sense, the end justifies the means if it serves the greater good of a greater number of people. The deontological system is a morality that is determined by a set of morals or principles or a sense of duty around a set of guidelines and principles. So morality is determined where particulars are not the main focus. You look at a broad category and determine a principle or a set of guidelines that give direction to that category, and then you apply it in these various situations. Motivism is the idea of morality being determined by personal preference and feelings of what is right and wrong. So this is something that we see in our day and age where people can have strong feelings about something. It's really not rooted in a deontological sense of duty or principle, and it may not even be oriented around serving the greatest good or greatest good for the greatest number of people, but it's how does one feel about it, a sense of personal preference and feeling that is determining what's right and wrong. The next is labeled relativism or situationalism, and this is a morality that really is driven on a case-by-case basis to looking at particular situations and not necessarily applying a sense of a deontological system of principles to these situations, but just looking case by case and making decisions. It has a relativistic edge to it because it's looking at the situation and applying what is relatively appropriate to that situation as determined by that situation. The final ethical system or theory that is mentioned by Ray and Scott as they walk through these 6 approaches is the virtue theory. And this is where morality is determined not simply by doing the right thing, but also by who a person is in terms of their character. So virtue theorists are driving towards the argument that it is not just a sense of duty or just a sense of utility that drives a decision-making process, but rather we need to consider who the person is in terms of their character and their integrity, and how is that informing. And we'll actually talk quite a bit about virtue theory a little bit later in this presentation, because I think it's in some ways it's not fair just to list it as one of 6 options. I think virtue theory, when understood, particularly from a Christian biblical framework, there is a unifying dimension that virtue theory can bring to the table, because it's not saying that you have to do virtue theory over utilitarianism or deontological and so forth. It's saying virtue needs to feed our ethical decision-making process. So it's more about who the person is, and then out of that, then they can give consideration to a set of moral principles. They can give it consideration to a particular situation. They can give consideration to what's the good that's going to be brought to a certain number of people. So all these other ones, I think, you can frame as having a place of consideration to one degree or another, but there is a foundational consideration given to virtue theory that informs. So that's kind of the argument that I'll be giving later on in our presentation time. But this gives a quick overview of some of the systems, ethical systems and theories that Ray and Wong highlight in Beyond Integrity. So when we think about various sources for moral reasoning, what are these primary sources of knowledge for moral reasoning? We could probably highlight more than this, but there are probably 3 primary sources of knowledge to highlight as we think about various forms and sources that people can draw upon for knowledge in their moral reasoning process. And these are the existential, situational, and normative. Now, these 3 labels might be fairly self-evident, but let's just name them quickly here. The existential is referring to the fact that we as subjects in a information moral reasoning process can gather knowledge based on our experience of a situation. So as a subject involved in this process, we existentially experience things, and that informs the way we think about things in terms of moral reasoning. A situational approach says that we draw upon knowledge based on unique situations. So we pay attention to context, we pay attention to the situation, and allow that to inform the reasoning process in ethical decision making. The normative dimension is connected to what we were talking about earlier with the deontological duty-oriented approach, where there is a sense of normative forms of knowledge, sources of a set of principles and guidelines and rules to govern things normatively, meaning principles that should be applied in a normative flow of life for all individuals. So certainly the Bible would be an example of a normative source of knowledge in moral reasoning. And the argument here is not to sort of position these all against each other, but to say, are we drawing upon all of these sources, gaining normative insight to influence the way we look at situations, our own experience of those situations. So building on this, how then do the existential and situational sources complement or work with the Bible as an example of one source of normative knowledge? Well, again, I don't see these as needing to be competitive with one another. When there is a normative source of knowledge where we're gaining a sense of principles and insights and guidelines from Scripture, that doesn't have to be set against oppositionally one's existential experiences and knowledge and one's situational experiences and knowledge. They can work together in a unified and collaborative way. And so I'm putting these forward as complementary forms of gaining knowledge. The challenge is when one preferences a situational or existential source of moral reasoning over and against normative sources of knowledge, and that's kind of what we are dealing with in this, postmodern-esque culture that we're in, is when those are pitted against normative knowledge. So some have defined postmodernity really as incredulity towards meta-narrative, meaning it's just this sense of anytime somebody is saying there is a unifying story or unifying set of principles that can be foisted upon all people, that is just something to be incredulous towards. And so a pure postmodern perspective has that incredulity towards meta-narrative, and so it would be preferencing the existential or situational over normative. I do see that as problematic from my vantage point. But when the normative is part of the source of knowledge, then it is a unified perspective that draws on all of these various sources of knowledge. Now, I think this presses us then towards the virtue-oriented approach. I've already been sort of sharing my leaning towards virtue ethics as an important dimension in answering the question of how these are brought together. That really is about the who in the decision-making process. So we'll be spending a good deal of time talking about how virtue ethics help guide the implementation and use of these various sources of moral reasoning knowledge as well. Well, if we're going to dig into a couple ethical theories, I think two that would be helpful to dig into a little bit more are utilitarianism and then the normative, duty-oriented approaches. So we'll talk about categorical kind of imperatives as well as a second one. But utilitarianism really is driven by the premise of how do we do the greatest good for the greatest number. So this is what could be referred to as an act-oriented theory that's focused on situations and the unique situations that guide ethical situations or dilemmas that need answers. So this is using what is sometimes referred to as a mental balance sheet. Right? What's the good that's going to be brought about through this decision? What's the harm? And does the good outweigh the harm for a greater number of people? And so, can you kind of add this sort of calculus to the decision-making process to sort of add up this weighing the balance sheet? And is there more good that will come of it than harm? And then you go with the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Now, on the one hand, there's some strengths to this, in that it is focusing on maximizing benefit, and it's focusing on maximizing that benefit to as many people as possible. But along with that is a challenge, and it's certainly a challenge when we focus on a group that can diminish the value of an individual or a minority population in a group. So issues of oppression, injustice can come into play here when decision-making process is made for the greatest number of people, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. What about those on the margins in that calculus, right? How are we considering the impact of this utilitarian pragmatic decision on those who are not benefiting from that? And so there can be a very dehumanizing weakness and challenge when this is brought to bear, because it doesn't necessarily give consideration to those who are going to be most affected by that, even though they are the individual in the group or the minority in the group. Well, somewhat in contrast to utilitarianism is a categorical imperative, and this is really connected to a deontological way of thinking about things. It's doing what is right despite the consequences. So it's very principle and duty-oriented in its focus. So this is a duty-oriented or deontological theory focused on guiding rules, looking at classes of decisions that need to be made rather than specific situations. So it's not a situationalism kind of approach. It's saying, how do we apply a rule categorically so that we're not digging into situations and just paying attention to what the consequences will be in that unique situation, but rather applying broad principles and rules. So strength of this is the categorical imperative avoids the danger of situational relativism, this idea that we just kind of shift our opinion depending on what's happening in a unique situation. So it helps to avoid relativistic kind of tendencies, but a challenge, of course, is that situations press those sorts of rules, right? There are times where a situation challenges this. You think about a class of a rule such as don't kill. Well, how does that get challenged and pressed when applied to unique situations? What about capital punishment? I know people have strong convictions on both sides of that. Well, how does that broad category of don't kill apply to unique situations? Or what about the broad category of don't kill when you are in a defensive posture? Somebody is threatening your family with life and limb, and how do you respond to that? And is killing a part of the equation when you are in a defensive posture? So unique situations challenge that. And then there also is the reality of conflicting duties as an example as well. So if you are a manager or a leader in an organization, how does a duty towards a boss as well as a duty towards coworkers and or those who report to you, there are different duties that we have as one individual in those workplace environments, and there can be conflicting dimensions in that duties. How do we process the categorical rules when there are unique situations that are providing conflicting duties as well? So the categorical imperative can be challenged by those situational realities. One of the things I'd like to highlight here is the act-oriented and rule-oriented views of ethics. It was somewhat brought up in what we were talking about in the previous slides on utilitarianism and the categorical imperative. I just want to unpack that a bit more here, that the act-oriented view of ethics is a form of situationism, right? So it's looking at unique situations and then being committed to ethical analysis that proceeds entirely on a case-by-case basis. So rather than looking at general principles, it looks at unique cases and lets that act-oriented view guide the way situationally. In contrast to that, the rule-oriented view of ethics places individual acts into a class and then applies a rule or absolute norm to all choices in that class. So some contrasting dimensions, again, somewhat connected to what we were talking about with utilitarianism, situational relativism, and this categorical imperative type of deontological way of thinking. Now, similarly, and building on that, are some distinctions that we can look at here between deontological and teleological ethics. So, deontological ethics, rooted in that Greek terminology around de, meaning it is necessary, pointing to duty or obligation along the way. Teleological ethics, rooted in that Greek word telos, focusing on end, and what are the ends that come out of it. So, is it an ethic that is more by necessity, duty, obligation, deontologically, or is it an ethic that's rooted on what is accomplished? And now, in its kind of positive or negative, the logic of the teleological ethics orientation is here the ends can justify the means. Now, that is maybe an overly utilitarian way of arguing that. I think there can be a dimension of looking at teleological ethics through a purpose and mission oriented point as well. What's the purpose you have as a leader? What's the purpose of the broader organization? Are you considering the impact of ethical decisions on those ends? Well, then there is a dimension of teleological thinking in the decision-making process from that angle as well. We talked briefly about some of situationism and some of the relativism that's connected to that. So what is situationism, and how have at least some Christians responded to this approach? One way of kind of summarizing situationism is Fletcher's situationism point, noting the danger of having this principle of slavishly following absolutes while ignoring the uniqueness of specific moral situations. Yeah, so a classic example might be the idea of, do you lie to hide somebody who is threatened by Nazi Germany? Right? We have those kinds of examples there where sort of a slavish following of the rule, don't lie, may be challenged by a competing interest of needing to care for and help preserve the life of an individual. And people, of course, have wrestled with those type of situations for decades and thinking through those dilemmas. But it's something that Fletcher's situationism points to in some of those realities. The challenge, of course, is it presses relativism, and how do we engage in thinking through ethical norms in light of those situations? So here are some responses to Fletcher's situationism. I think the one that I have sort of latched onto as helpful and draw upon regularly in thinking about is Packer's principle of love and law. And it's kind of referred to as an ideal absolutism, where love motivates action while law guides it. So the sort of the deontological guidance of law or principle or rule is the sort of the power behind the decision that needs to be made, but love is what guides it and nuances how that law is being applied in these situations. So love and law, love motivates action while law guides it. Evangelical contextualism emphasizes the theme of paying attention to the situation and context, but not running to antinomianism, kind of being without law. So how do we pay attention to context but not sort of throw off all restraints with an antinomianism? And so it's the idea of the true voice of God being heard and seen in situations in light of signposts along the way, such as the Ten Commandments or the Greatest Commandments, Sermon on the Mount, these type of principles. So how are people paying attention to the situation, not completely throwing away law, but allowing these signposts from Scripture to inform and provide guidance along the way while still attending to the uniquenesses of context and situation. Finally, Kraft highlights contextual sensitive principalism and such as the general transcultural principles and specific culturally relevant applications working together in ethical theory. So not sort of setting these apart from each other, but trying to bring the general transcultural alongside the specific cultural and having them inform each other in the ethical decision-making process. Now, we've been talking quite a bit along the way here about deontological approaches that have a duty-oriented approach to decision-making. And in some ways, I would want to argue, because deontological ethics and duty-oriented ethics are fairly normative from a Christian worldview, people think this way, apply this a lot. I would want to say the deontological approach is helpful, but it's not the only story. So how do we shift from a duty-only approach to a gospel-dependent approach in pursuing ethical behavior? So as we think about these themes, the reality is we do not live in a utopian world that's free of the effects of sin. This is not the kind of vision of a Christian world that we have, because apart from Christ making all things new at the end of time and creating for us a new heavens and a new earth where we do not have the effects of sin alive and well. Apart from that reality, we live in a fallen world, and so we need to understand how to approach that world. The reality is that moralism and over focus on legalism, moralism, has dangers and inadequacies and ultimately ineffectualities that are connected to it. So how do we move past this? I would argue that a sort of a gospel-dependent approach to ethics values deontological duty, but gives a priority to the virtue-oriented conversation that people ultimately need first and foremost to be transformed themselves. There is a clear need for sinful human beings to be transformed by Christ. In other words, the ontological becomes a priority over merely behavioral answers. We see a little hint of this in the way John talks about things at a couple points. And in John 1, Jesus is not just described as one who is behaviorally engaging in graceful and truthful practices, though he does that. He is described to us as being full of grace and truth. In other words, embodying grace and truth in who he is as the incarnate Word of God in our midst. Now, John 3 also introduces the fact that really the answer to the sin issue and the ethical issues that we face is that the answer is not new rules, like that the old covenant rules were not good enough, so we need new covenant rules. The rules was not the focus. The answer was primarily to be born again, not just to have new rules added to the picture. And I would say all of this provides a vote and an affirmation for virtue ethics as primary, supporting other forms of act-oriented and duty-oriented theories. This, in my mind, is not about dismissing the other pathways of ethical thinking and engagement, but rather having those infused by and informed by the priority of giving attention to who the ethical decision maker is. In other words, paying attention to character and to informing these other virtue ways of thinking, these systems and theories.